widow's face was so blackened by soot and ash that when Orion Zeller first saw her hauling timber through the pine forest outside St. Elmo, Colorado, he mistook her for a man until she turned, and he caught the curve of her body beneath the filthy canvas coat. It was late September of 1878, and the mountain air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter. Orion had been tracking a mule deer for the better part of the afternoon, his rifle slung across his broad shoulders, his buckskin shirt stretched tight across muscles hardened by years of surviving alone in these unforgiving peaks. The woman didn't notice him at first. She was too focused on dragging a fallen branch nearly twice her size, her boots slipping on the carpet of pine needles, her breathing labored but determined. Everything about her was covered in black, her face, her hands, her clothes, even her hair, which was tied back with a strip of leather that might have once been another color entirely. She looked like she'd crawled out of the earth itself, or perhaps from the depths of hell. Orion watched from behind a thick ponderosa pine. His curiosity piqued. He knew most of the folks who lived in these mountains, at least by reputation, and he'd heard tell of old Silas Dalton, the charcoal maker who lived in a shack about 3 miles northeast of St. Elmo. Silas had died last spring, folks said, crushed under a load of timber when his cart tipped on the mountain path. That would make this woman his widow. He'd heard she'd kept working the charcoal pit alone, which seemed like madness to most people. Making charcoal was brutal work even for a man, requiring constant attention to the burn, careful arrangement of the wood, days and nights of tending the smoking mounds. The work covered you in soot and ash, made your lungs burn, and offered little reward beyond a few dollars for the blackened lumps that fueled the town's forges and stoves. The widow lost her grip on the branch, and it rolled back down the incline, nearly taking her with it. She let out a frustrated sound that was half sob, half growl, then planted her hands on her knees and bent forward, her whole body shaking with exhaustion. Orion made his decision. He stepped out from behind the tree, making enough noise that she wouldn't be startled. She jerked upright anyway, her hand flying to something at her belt. A knife, he saw. "Easy," he said, keeping his voice low and calm like he might speak to a spooked horse. "Name's Orion Zeller. I live about 5 miles north of here. Saw you struggling with that timber. Thought you might could use a hand." The widow stared at him through eyes that showed white against the blackness of her face. She didn't lower the knife. "I don't need help from nobody." Her voice surprised him. It was younger than he'd expected, and there was a musical quality to it beneath the exhaustion and weariness. "That branch weighs near 200 pounds, Orion said, "and you're trying to haul it uphill. Seems like you could use help whether you need it or not." "I've been managing just fine on my own for 6 months." "Didn't say you haven't been managing. Just offering to make the managing a bit easier." He kept his hands visible, away from the rifle and the hunting knife at his own belt. He was a big man, standing well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad as an axe handle and arms thick with muscle from years of chopping wood, hauling water, and wrestling with nature itself. His hair was a dark brown that fell past his shoulders, usually tied back with a leather cord, and his face was weathered from constant exposure to sun and wind. He knew he could be intimidating, especially to a woman alone in the woods. The widow studied him for a long moment. He could see her weighing her options, measuring the risk. Finally, she lowered the knife, but didn't sheath it. "1 branch, that's all." Orion nodded and walked past her to where the timber had rolled. He bent and lifted it with a grunt, settling the weight across his shoulders. "Where to?" She hesitated, then seemed to realize she'd already committed. "Follow me." They walked in silence through the forest, climbing steadily upward. The widow moved with the kind of determined exhaustion that spoke of someone who'd been pushing herself too hard for too long. Her steps were uneven, and more than once she stumbled on roots or stones that should have been easy to avoid. The charcoal site was worse than Orion had imagined. The small cabin looked like it might collapse in the next strong wind, its roof patched with bark and canvas. The charcoal mounds were scattered around the clearing, some still smoking, others cold and abandoned. Piles of wood in various stages of preparation lay everywhere, and the smell of smoke and ash was so thick it made his eyes water. "Over there," the widow said, pointing to a half-built mound. "I'm starting a new burn." Orion carried the branch where she indicated and set it down carefully. When he straightened, he got his first good look at her face in direct sunlight. Even covered in soot, he could make out delicate features beneath the grime. Her eyes were a startling light color, gray or blue or green, hard to tell with all the black around them. "How long since you've had a proper wash?" The question came out before he could stop it. Those light eyes flashed with anger. "What business is that of yours?" "None at all," he admitted. "But there's a creek about a quarter-mile east of here. Good, clean water, deep enough to bathe in. Might do you some good to clean up a bit. I've got work to do. Don't have time for vanity." "Not talking about vanity. Talking about basic care. You work yourself to death out here. Won't matter how much charcoal you make." He shouldn't care. He'd lived alone in these mountains for nearly 8 years, ever since he'd left his family's ranch in Wyoming after his father died and his brothers started fighting over the land. He'd learned to mind his own business and expect others to do the same. But something about this woman pulled at him. Maybe it was the stubborn set of her shoulders, the way she kept standing even though she looked ready to collapse. Maybe it was the loneliness he recognized, because it matched his own. "I thank you for the help with the timber," she said, her tone making it clear she was dismissing him. Orion nodded and turned to go. He made it to the edge of the clearing before his conscience got the better of him. He looked back. The widow was already working on arranging the branch he'd carried, her movements slow and awkward. "What's your name?" he called. She didn't look up. "Delilah Dalton." "Delilah." He let the name sit on his tongue for a moment. It suited her, musical and strong all at once. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" This time she did look up, and he saw something crack in her expression. For just an instant, the fierce independence wavered, and he saw the fear and exhaustion beneath it. Then the mask was back in place. "I eat fine." She was lying. He could see it in the way her clothes hung on her frame, in the tremor in her hands. "I've got fresh deer meat hanging at my camp. More than I can eat before it spoils. Be ashamed to waste it. I don't need your charity. Not charity, trade. You give me some of that charcoal for my forge, I'll bring you some meat. Fair exchange." Delilah was quiet for so long, he thought she'd refuse. Then, very quietly, she said, "I could spare some charcoal." "Good. I'll bring the meat by tomorrow." "And Delilah?" He waited until she met his eyes. "Do yourself a favor and get cleaned up before then. Not for me, for yourself. You've got soot in your eyes, your lungs, probably in cuts you don't even know you have. Infection will kill you just as sure as starvation." He didn't wait for her response. He headed back into the forest, tracking his way toward his own camp with the ease of long practice. But his mind wasn't on the familiar path. He kept seeing those light eyes staring out from that blackened face. Kept hearing the exhaustion in her voice. Orion reached his camp as the sun was starting to sink behind the western peaks. His setup was simple but comfortable, built over years of careful work. A sturdy log cabin with a stone fireplace, a small forge where he made and repaired tools, a smokehouse, and a corral for his 2 horses. He'd carved out a good life here, trading furs and metalwork in St. Elmo for supplies, hunting and fishing for food, spending his days in the kind of solitude that let a man hear himself think. Lonely, though. That was the truth he usually didn't let himself acknowledge. It got lonely up here, especially when winter closed in and he might go months without seeing another soul. He spent the evening butchering the deer he'd killed that morning, working by lamplight to cut the meat into portions. He set aside the best cuts, wrapping them in clean cloth. Then he dug through his supplies until he found a bar of soap he'd bought in town last month, still wrapped in paper. He added it to the bundle. Sleep came slowly that night. He kept thinking about Delilah Dalton, alone in that falling-down cabin, working herself to death in those charcoal pits. What drove a woman to do that? Pride, probably. Fear of charity, of being seen as weak or incapable. He understood that. He'd felt the same way when he'd first struck out on his own, determined to prove he didn't need his brothers or anyone else. But understanding it and agreeing with it were different things. There was a difference between independence and self-destruction. Morning came cold and clear, frost sparkling on the grass around his cabin. Orion packed the meat and soap into his saddlebag, slung his rifle over his shoulder out of habit, and set out on foot toward the charcoal site. The walk took about an hour, and with each step he found himself walking a little faster, eager in a way that surprised him. The clearing looked different in morning light, somehow even more desolate. 2 of the charcoal mounds were smoking, which meant Delilah had been up tending them through the night. Orion felt a flash of irritation. Didn't the woman have any sense of self-preservation? The cabin door was closed. He knocked gently at first, then louder when there was no response. Nothing. He tried the handle and found it unlocked. The interior was dim and smoky, lit only by the gray light filtering through gaps in the walls. It took his eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, he saw Delilah collapsed on a narrow cot in the corner, still wearing her soot-covered clothes, her chest rising and falling in the deep rhythm of exhausted sleep. Orion stood in the doorway, uncertain. He shouldn't be in here. It wasn't proper. But he also couldn't just leave. The cabin was freezing, and the small stove in the corner had gone cold. She'd burned through what little strength she had left if she didn't rest properly. He made his decision. Moving quietly, he went to the stove and built up the fire, using kindling from the box beside it. The warmth began to spread through the small space. He set the wrapped meat on the rough table, then hesitated with the soap in his hand. Finally, he set it beside the meat with a brief note written on a scrap of paper from his pocket. "For the creek. You earned it." He was almost out the door when he heard her stir. "Who's there?" He turned. She was sitting up, her hand once again on that knife at her belt, her eyes wide with alarm. "Just me," he said quickly. "Orion, I brought the meat like I said I would. You were asleep, but the fire had gone out, so I relit it. Didn't mean to intrude." Delilah's hand slowly lowered from the knife. She looked around the cabin as if seeing it fresh, taking in the rebuilt fire, the bundle on the table. "You didn't have to do that." "I know, but it seemed wrong to let you freeze when I could do something about it." He gestured to the table. "That's good venison. Should last you a few days if you keep it cool. There's soap too. My gift, not part of the trade." She stood slowly, swaying a bit. When she moved toward the table, he saw her limp. "You hurt your leg?" "Just tired. I'm fine." She wasn't fine. That much was obvious. But Orion had learned you couldn't help someone who wouldn't admit they needed help. "I'll take that charcoal whenever you have it ready. No rush." He left before she could respond, before he could do something stupid like insist on checking her leg or forcing her to rest. She was a grown woman, capable of making her own choices. If she wanted to work herself into an early grave, that was her business. But he couldn't stop thinking about her as he walked back to his camp. Couldn't stop wondering if she'd use the soap, if she'd eat the meat or try to save it all for some undefined future. Couldn't stop seeing those light eyes staring out from that blackened face. 3 days passed. Orion tried to focus on his own work, repairing tack for his horses, checking his trap lines, smoking fish from the stream near his cabin. But his mind kept wandering back to the clearing in the woods, to the woman working alone in the ashes and smoke. On the 4th day, he gave up pretending he wasn't going to check on her and headed back to the charcoal site. This time, he heard her before he saw her. The sound of an axe biting into wood echoed through the forest. He followed the sound to find Delilah attacking a log with fierce determination, her swings increasingly wild and uncontrolled. "You're going to cut your own leg off swinging like that?" he said from the edge of the clearing. Delilah spun, the axe still in her hands. She was just as black with soot as before, maybe even more so. "What are you doing back here?" "Came to check if you had that charcoal ready, but mostly I came to see if you were still alive." "Well, I am, so you can go." Instead of leaving, Orion walked closer. He could see the strain in every line of her body, the way her hands trembled on the axe handle. "When's the last time you slept? And I mean really slept, not just collapsed from exhaustion." "That's none of your concern." "Maybe not, but I'm making it my concern anyway." He held out his hand. "Give me the axe. You're going to hurt yourself." "I don't need you to take care of me. I've been taking care of myself just fine." "Have you?" He gestured around the clearing. "You've got 3 burns going at once, which means you're not sleeping more than an hour or 2 at a time. You're limping worse than you were 4 days ago. And unless I miss my guess, you still haven't been to that creek." Delilah's jaw set stubbornly. What does it matter to you what I do? It was a fair question, one Orion had been asking himself. Why did he care? He'd passed plenty of people in these mountains, plenty of folks struggling to survive, and he'd never felt compelled to insert himself into their lives. But something about Delilah Dalton had gotten under his skin, and he couldn't shake it loose. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do care. So humor me. Let me help you finish this work, and then you're going to take a break, just 1 day. Is that so much to ask?" "You don't understand. I have orders to fill. The general store in St. Elmo, the blacksmith, even some of the mines. They're depending on me. And they'll keep depending on you if you're dead." She flinched at that. "I'm not going to die. Not if I can help it." Orion took the axe from her hands, gently but firmly. "Show me what needs doing." For a moment, he thought she'd fight him on it. Then something in her seemed to give way. Her shoulders slumped and she nodded toward the log she'd been working on. "That needs to be split and stacked for the next burn. Then I need to check the middle mound, make sure it's burning even." "I can do that. You go sit down." "I can't just sit while you work." "Then you can supervise. Tell me if I'm doing something wrong." He swung the axe, feeling the satisfying bite as it sank deep into the wood. The log split clean, and he moved to the next section. Delilah watched him work, and gradually she did sink down onto a stump near the edge of the clearing. Orion kept chopping, falling into the rhythm of the work. It felt good to use his muscles, to do something productive. And it felt even better to see Delilah resting, even if she watched him like she expected him to disappear or demand something in return at any moment. They didn't talk much as he worked. When he finished with the wood, She directed him to the middle mound, explaining how to check the vents and adjust the covering to ensure an even burn. It was fascinating work, actually, requiring a delicate balance of air and heat. Too much oxygen, and the wood would burn to ash instead of charcoal. Too little, and the fire would go out entirely. By the time the sun reached its peak, Orion had finished everything that needed immediate attention. He was covered in sweat and ash himself now, his shirt clinging to his back. "There," he said, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. "That should hold for a bit. Now, you're going to take a break." Delilah stood, and he saw her try to hide a wince as she put weight on her bad leg. "I appreciate the help, but I'll be fine now." "No," Orion said flatly. "You're not fine, and we both know it. That leg needs tending. When's the last time you looked at it?" "It's just bruised." "Let me see." "Absolutely not. That would be improper. Improper is letting an injury fester until it kills you." He softened his tone. "I'm not trying to compromise you, Delilah. I've treated enough injuries in these mountains to know what I'm looking at. If it's just a bruise, fine, I'll leave you be. But if it's worse, you need help." She stared at him for a long moment, those light eyes searching his face for something. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she gave a short nod. Inside. The cabin was warmer now, the fire he'd built still burning. Delilah sat on the cot and, with obvious reluctance, pulled up the leg of her trousers. Even through the soot and dirt, Orion could see the angry red inflammation spreading from a deep cut on her calf. "How'd you get that?" "Caught it on a sharp edge hauling wood a few days ago." "It's infected." He could see the telltale signs, the heat radiating from it, the way she pulled away when he got close. "You need to clean this properly. And I mean properly, not just wiping it with a dirty rag. I don't have time for this. Make time." He stood and moved to the door. "I'm going to that creek you won't visit. Going to bring back clean water, and you're going to wash this leg and let me pack it with herbs. Either that or you can head into St. Elmo and see the doctor, but something tells me you won't do that." "I can't afford the doctor." "Then you do it my way." He didn't wait for her agreement. He grabbed a pot from near the stove and headed out, moving quickly toward the creek he'd mentioned days before. The water ran clear and cold, fed by mountain snowmelt. He filled the pot and carried it back carefully, not wanting to spill a drop. When he returned to the cabin, he found Delilah sitting exactly where he'd left her, her face tight with pain and stubborn pride. Orion set the pot near the fire to warm slightly, then turned to her. "This is going to hurt, but it needs to be done. That infection spreads much more and you'll lose the leg. Or worse." Something in his tone must have finally gotten through to her, because she nodded. "Do what you need to do." He worked as gently as he could, cleaning the wound with water and the soap he'd brought. She didn't cry out, but he saw her bite her lip hard enough to draw blood. The cut was deep and ugly, clearly several days old. He cleaned it thoroughly, then packed it with yarrow and comfrey he kept in his pack for exactly this kind of emergency. "You'll need to keep this clean," he said as he wrapped it with a strip of cloth torn from his spare shirt. "Change the dressing every day and stay off it as much as possible." "I can't stay off it. I have work to do." "Then let me help you." The words came out before he'd fully thought them through. "I'll come by every day, help with the heavy work. You can supervise, keep the burns going. But you need to rest that leg or you'll never heal." "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." It was the same question she'd asked before, and Orion still didn't have a good answer. "Maybe I'm tired of being alone all the time." Maybe I like having someone to talk to, even if that someone is the most stubborn woman in Colorado. Or maybe I just don't want to find you dead next time I come by." Delilah looked away, and he saw her throat work as she swallowed. "I don't have money to pay you." "Don't want money. Trade is fine. Charcoal when you have it, and maybe some of your company now and then." She turned back to him, and for the first time, he saw something other than suspicion in her eyes. Something that might have been hope, or maybe just relief that she wasn't alone anymore. "All right. But just until my leg heals." "Just until then," he agreed, even though they both knew he was lying. When Orion left the charcoal site that evening, he felt lighter somehow, like something tight in his chest had loosened. He told himself it was just the satisfaction of helping someone in need, of doing a good deed. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. The next morning, he was up before dawn, packing supplies for the day. He brought more food, bandages, and a skin of water. The walk to the charcoal site felt shorter somehow, his feet finding the path almost without thought. Delilah was already awake, sitting outside the cabin and tending one of the smaller burns. She looked up when he approached, and he thought he saw something like relief flash across her soot-blackened face. "You came back," she said. "Said I would, didn't I?" He set down his pack. "How's the leg?" "Better. Still hurts, but the fever's gone down." "Good." He'd been worried about that all night. "Let me see it later. Make sure it's healing right. For now, show me what needs doing." They fell into a routine over the following days. Orion would arrive at dawn, work through the morning on whatever heavy labor needed doing, then share a midday meal with Delilah while the burns tended themselves. She'd talk him through the finer points of charcoal making, teaching him how to read the smoke, how to judge when a burn was ready to be quenched. In the afternoons, he'd work on repairs to the cabin and outbuildings, slowly making the place more livable. And every evening, before the sun set, he'd check her leg and change the bandage. It was healing well, the infection retreating day by day. But the thing that struck him most was not the work or the healing. It was how comfortable they became with each other. Delilah gradually relaxed in his presence, her sharp edges softening. She talked more, sharing stories about her life before Silas died, about growing up in St. Elmo as the daughter of a seamstress, about how she'd married Silas when she was 22 because he'd seemed kind and steady, even if he was 20 years older. "He was a good man," she said one afternoon as they sat in the shade of a pine tree, eating bread and dried meat. "Not much for romance or sweet words. But he never raised a hand to me. Never drank away our money or ran with other women. When he died, I thought I'd have to move back to town, maybe try to get work as a laundress or cook. But then I thought, why not just keep doing what we'd been doing? I knew the work, I had the equipment. Seemed wasteful to just abandon it. Couldn't have been easy, doing it alone. It wasn't, but I managed." She looked at him, and he saw pride in her eyes. "I proved I could do it." "You did more than that," Orion said. "You survived. That's no small thing." They were sitting close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Close enough that Orion could smell the pine smoke that seemed permanently woven into her hair and clothes. Close enough that when she shifted, her hand brushed against his. She didn't pull away immediately. Neither did he, Orion. She said softly, "I need to ask you something." "Ask." "Why are you really doing this? And don't tell me it's because you like the company or you want charcoal. There's got to be more to it than that." He thought about lying, about giving her some easy answer that wouldn't complicate things. But she deserved the truth. "At first, I told myself it was just about helping someone in need. But that wasn't the whole truth, even then. Truth is, from the moment I saw you in those woods, struggling with that timber, something in me woke up. Something I thought I'd buried when I left Wyoming and came to these mountains. What was that? The need to matter to someone. To be more than just a man, alone in the wilderness. He looked at her directly. I'm here because being with you makes me feel alive, in a way I haven't felt in years. Delilah was quiet for a long moment. Then, very slowly, she said, I should probably tell you to leave. Tell you it's not proper for us to spend so much time alone together. Tell you I'm still in mourning for my husband. Are you going to tell me that? No. She lifted her hand and placed it deliberately over his. Because I'd be lying. And I'm tired of lying, even to myself. Orion turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. Her palm was rough with calluses, blackened with soot that no amount of washing seemed to fully remove. It was the most beautiful thing he'd ever held. I should tell you, Delilah continued, her voice barely above a whisper, that I'm a mess. That I'm broken and scared, and I don't know how to be anything other than what I've been for the last 6 months. I should tell you that I'll probably push you away and make this harder than it needs to be. I don't care about that. You should. Well, I don't. He squeezed her hand gently. I'm not afraid of complicated, Delilah. I'm not afraid of hard work or stubborn women or building something from nothing. That's all I've done for 8 years now. She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her soot-covered face. You really are crazy, you know that? Probably. But so are you. Living up here alone, making charcoal like some kind of mountain hermit. Fair enough. She leaned against his shoulder, and Orion felt something settle in his chest, something warm and right. So, what do we do now? Now, he said, I think you finally go to that creek and wash your face. Because as much as I've gotten used to the soot, I'd like to see what you actually look like underneath all that black. Delilah pulled back, and he saw uncertainty flash across her face. I don't know if that's a good idea. Why not? Because what if you don't like what you see? What if I clean up and you realize you were wrong about me? Orion stood and pulled her gently to her feet. That's not going to happen. But there's only one way to prove it. Come on. He led her through the forest toward the creek, still holding her hand. She followed, limping less now that her leg was healing. The afternoon sun filtered through the pines, dappling the path with golden light. The creek was as beautiful as he remembered, flowing over smooth stones, creating small pools deep enough to bathe in. Orion stopped at the edge and turned to Delilah. I'll wait over there, he said, pointing to a boulder about 20 yards away. Take your time. Really get clean, not just a quick splash. I brought that soap, and there's a clean shirt in my pack if you want it. Delilah nodded, looking nervous but determined. She took the soap from him and walked to the edge of the creek. Orion moved to the boulder and sat with his back to her, giving her privacy. He heard the splash of water, then quiet sounds that might have been crying or laughing or both. He forced himself to stay put, to not turn around, even though every instinct wanted to make sure she was all right. Time stretched. The sun moved lower in the sky. Still Orion waited. Finally, he heard footsteps behind him. You can look now. He turned, and his breath caught in his throat. The woman standing before him bore little resemblance to the soot-covered widow he'd met in the forest. Her face was clean, revealing skin the color of cream, smooth and fine-boned. Her hair, freed from its leather tie and washed clean, fell in dark waves past her shoulders, so dark brown it was almost black, with hints of red where the sun caught it. But it was her eyes that stopped him. They were gray-green, the color of sage after rain, wide and expressive and absolutely stunning. She was beautiful, not in the delicate, fragile way of the ladies he'd seen in town, but in a way that spoke of strength and survival, of a spirit that refused to be broken no matter what life threw at it. "Well?" Delilah asked, and he heard the vulnerability in her voice. "Was I right to be worried?" Orion stood and walked toward her, slowly, like he might approach something wild and precious that he didn't want to startle. When he was close enough to see the water droplets still clinging to her eyelashes, he stopped. "You're beautiful," he said, and his voice came out rough with emotion. "Not just your face, though, that's lovely enough, but everything about you. Your strength, your stubbornness, your refusal to give up even when any sane person would have quit. You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, Delilah Dalton. And that was true even when you were covered in soot." Her eyes filled with tears. "You mean that? Every word." He lifted his hand slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. "I was drawn to you from the start. Seeing you like this now, it just confirms what I already knew." Delilah leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. "I don't know how to do this, Orion. I was married for 4 years, but it wasn't like this. Silas was kind, but there was never this feeling, this electricity. I don't know what to do with it." "You don't have to do anything. Just let it be. Let us be." He stroked her cheek gently. "We'll figure it out as we go." She opened her eyes and looked up at him. "Can I ask you something else? Anything? Will you kiss me? I know it's forward of me to ask, but I want to know what it feels like. What this feels like." Orion didn't answer with words. Instead, he lowered his head slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. When his lips finally met hers, it was soft and gentle, a question more than a statement. Delilah answered by pressing closer, her hands coming up to grip his shirt. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more real. Orion wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest, feeling how perfectly she fit there. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Delilah rested her forehead against his chest. "Oh," she said softly. "That's what it's supposed to feel like." Orion laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Yeah, that's what it's supposed to feel like." They stood there for a long moment, just holding each other as the creek burbled beside them and the sun sank lower in the sky. Finally, practical considerations intruded. "We should get back," Delilah said reluctantly. "I need to check the burns before dark." "I know." But Orion didn't release her immediately. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the clean smell of her hair, now scented with the soap instead of smoke. "But we're going to do this again. Soon." "Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," he agreed. "And every day after that, if you'll have me." They walked back to the charcoal site, hand in hand, and something had fundamentally shifted between them. Where before there had been caution and uncertainty, now there was a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place. Over the following weeks, a new rhythm developed. Orion still came every morning to help with the heavy work, but now they worked side by side as partners rather than helper and helped. Delilah's leg healed fully, though she no longer pushed herself to the point of collapse. With Orion's help, she could maintain her burns without sacrificing her health. And every evening, before Orion headed back to his own cabin. They'd steal a few moments together by the creek or in the clearing, learning each other through kisses and quiet conversations. They talked about everything, their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Orion told her about growing up in Wyoming, about watching his father work himself to death, trying to make the ranch successful, about the bitter fights with his brothers after the funeral. Delilah shared memories of her mother teaching her to sew, of the loneliness of her marriage to Silas, of the terror she'd felt when he died and left her alone. "I thought I'd lost everything when he died," she admitted one evening as they sat watching the stars emerge. "The security, the partnership, the knowledge that someone cared whether I lived or died. But now I wonder if maybe I never really had those things. Not the way they were supposed to be." "What do you mean?" "Silas cared about me in his way. But it was like caring about a good horse or well-made tool, something useful that made his life easier. He never asked what I wanted or what I dreamed about. Never seemed to think I might have thoughts beyond keeping house and helping with the charcoal." She looked at Orion. "You ask me what I think. You listen when I talk. You see me as a person, not just a pair of hands to help with the work. That's how it should be," Orion said. "That's how love should be. Partnership. Two people choosing each other, day after day." Delilah's breath hitched. Love? Orion realized what he'd said. He could backtrack, could claim he was speaking hypothetically. But why? It was the truth. "Yes, love. I love you, Delilah. I know it's fast, and maybe it's crazy, but I do. I think I started falling the moment I saw you in those woods, and every day since then has just made me more certain." Tears spilled down her cheeks, catching the starlight. "I love you too. I think I have for weeks now. But I was afraid to say it. Afraid you'd think I was too forward, or that I was betraying Silas's memory, or a dozen other stupid things that don't matter when you're sitting here telling me you love me." Orion pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "Nothing else matters. Just this. Just us." As autumn deepened into winter, their relationship deepened too. Orion started staying later each evening, reluctant to leave Delilah alone in the cold cabin. Finally, one snowy night in late November, she asked him not to leave at all. "It's foolish for you to walk all the way back to your place in this weather," she said, trying to sound practical even as her eyes held a different invitation. "You could freeze to death in a storm like this. Just stay here tonight." Orion knew what she was really asking. "Delilah, I want that more than anything. But I won't compromise you. What will people in St. Elmo's say if word gets out that I'm spending nights here? I don't care what they say." She stepped closer to him, her eyes fierce. "I'm a widow, not a child. I can make my own choices. And I choose you, Orion. I choose this, if you want me to. You know I do." His voice was rough with want and restraint. "But I want to do this right. Let me marry you first. Let me make you my wife properly. So there's no question, no gossip, no one can say anything to hurt you." Delilah smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Is that a proposal?" "It is, if you'll have me. I don't have much to offer. Just a cabin in the mountains, 2 horses, and whatever I can make with my hands. But I'll love you with everything I am. I'll work beside you, protect you, stand with you against whatever comes. Say yes, Delilah. Marry me." "Yes." She threw her arms around his neck. "Yes, yes, yes. I'll marry you, Orion Zeller, and count myself lucky every day." They married 3 days later in St. Elmo, in a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of town. Delilah wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Orion had bought as a wedding gift, a deep blue that matched her eyes. Orion wore his best shirt and trousers, his hair trimmed and tied back neatly. The preacher was a kind man who asked no uncomfortable questions about how quickly they'd come to this decision. The only witnesses were the preacher's wife and old Tom Fletcher, the general store owner who'd been buying charcoal from Delilah for years. When Orion slipped the simple gold band onto Delilah's finger, his hand was steady. When he kissed her, as the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, it felt like coming home. They spent their wedding night at the charcoal site, in the cabin that was slowly becoming more livable thanks to Orion's repairs. He carried her over the threshold despite her laughing protests that it was silly and she was perfectly capable of walking. "Humor me," he said, setting her down gently inside. "I've waited my whole life for this moment. Let me enjoy it." What followed was tender and passionate, and everything a wedding night should be. Orion was careful with her, mindful that this might be new and frightening despite her previous marriage. But Delilah met him with equal passion, equal eagerness. And when they finally lay tangled together in the narrow cot, both breathless and amazed, she whispered, "So, that's what it's supposed to feel like too?" Orion laughed and pulled her closer. "Yeah, that's what it's supposed to feel like." In the weeks that followed, they began building a life together in earnest. Orion moved his belongings from his cabin to the charcoal site, combining their resources and skills. With his help, Delilah could maintain the charcoal burns more efficiently, allowing them to actually make a profit instead of just scraping by. And with Delilah's knowledge of the business, Orion learned a new trade to supplement his trapping and metalwork. But more than that, they built a partnership. They worked together, made decisions together, faced challenges together. When a heavy snow collapsed part of the cabin roof in January, they repaired it together. When a group of drunk miners showed up looking for trouble in February, they faced them together, Orion with his rifle and Delilah with her fierce courage, until the men backed down and left. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and bringing new life to the mountains. As the world greened around them, Delilah made an announcement that filled Orion with joy and terror in equal measure. "I'm with child," she said one morning as they worked together stacking wood. "I wasn't sure at first, but now I am. Due in late October, near as I can figure." Orion dropped the log he was holding and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to stop. "A baby? We're having a baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, and he heard the uncertainty in her voice. "I know we've only been married a few months, and money is still tight, and the cabin isn't very big, and—" He silenced her with a kiss. "I'm thrilled. Terrified, but thrilled. We'll manage, Delilah. We always do." And they did manage. Orion expanded the cabin, adding a second room for the baby. Delilah began scaling back her work in the charcoal pits as her belly grew, though she insisted on supervising and doing what she could. They saved every penny they could spare, preparing for the new life they'd be welcoming. On a cool October evening, as the aspens turned gold on the mountainsides, Delilah went into labor. Orion had arranged for a midwife from town to come when the time arrived, but the baby had other ideas. The labor came fast and hard, and there was no time to send for help. Orion had delivered foals and calves before, but this was different. This was his wife, his love, his whole world, and he'd never been so frightened in his life. But Delilah was strong, stronger than he'd ever imagined. And when the sun rose the next morning, their son was born, healthy and squalling. A boy. Delilah whispered, exhausted but radiant as she held the baby to her chest. We have a son. Orion looked down at his wife and child and felt something break open in his chest, some final wall he'd been holding up against the world crumbling to dust. He had a family now, a real family, people who depended on him, who loved him, who were his to protect and cherish. What should we name him? He asked, running a gentle finger over the baby's impossibly soft cheek. Samuel, Delilah said, after my father. Samuel Zeller. What do you think? I think it's perfect. He's perfect. You're perfect. Orion pressed a kiss to her forehead. Thank you, Delilah, for giving me this, for giving me everything. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. The charcoal business thrived with both of them working it, and Orion's metalwork brought in steady money as well. They expanded the cabin again as Samuel grew, making it comfortable and sturdy. 2 more children followed, a daughter named Rebecca, born in 1881, and another son, Michael, born in 1883. The work never stopped being hard. The mountains never stopped being dangerous. But they faced it all together, as partners, as lovers, as a family. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the charcoal burns were tended, Orion and Delilah would sit together on the porch he'd built, watching the stars and marveling at how far they'd come. Do you ever regret it? Delilah asked one such evening, her head resting on his shoulder. Giving up your solitary life for this chaos? Orion pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair. It still sometimes carried the faint smell of smoke, though nothing like those first days when she'd been covered in soot and ash. Not for a single moment. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Delilah. You and these children. This life we've built. Even though I was blackened with soot and half dead from exhaustion when you found me. Especially because of that. He tilted her chin up so he could see her face in the starlight. Because it showed me who you really are. Someone who fights, who survives, who refuses to give up no matter what. You were beautiful then, and you're beautiful now. And you'll be beautiful when we're old and gray and watching our grandchildren play in this clearing. Delilah smiled and kissed him softly. You always did know how to turn a phrase, mountain man. I learned from the best. Stubborn widow taught me everything I know. They laughed together, and the sound carried across the clearing, mixing with the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant hoot of an owl. It was the sound of happiness, hard-won and precious and absolutely real. As the seasons turned and the years passed, the Zeller family became a fixture in the St. Elmo community. Their charcoal was known for its quality, their word for its reliability. Samuel grew into a strong boy who loved working alongside his father, learning the mountains and the craft. Rebecca had her mother's fierce independence and her father's strength, a combination that promised interesting years ahead. Michael was still young, but already showing signs of being as stubborn as both his parents combined. In the summer of 1886, nearly 8 years after that first meeting in the forest, Orion and Delilah took a day to themselves. They left the children with Tom Fletcher's wife in town and hiked to the creek where Delilah had first washed away the soot, and Orion had first seen her true face. The place was just as beautiful as Orion remembered. Maybe more so, with the summer sun dappling the water and wildflowers blooming along the banks. They sat on the same boulder where he'd waited that day, and Delilah leaned against him with a contented sigh. Do you remember what I looked like that day? She asked, when I came out of the water and you saw me clean for the first time. Every detail, Orion said. The way your hair was wet and shining, the way the sun caught those gray-green eyes. The way you looked so nervous, like you were sure I'd be disappointed. I was terrified. I'd built you up in my head as this perfect man, and I was sure the reality of me would never measure up. You were wrong, Orion said, turning to face her fully. You exceeded every dream I'd ever had. Still do, every single day. Delilah reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines that time and sun had etched around his eyes. You washed away more than soot that day, you know. You washed away the loneliness, the fear, the feeling that I'd never be more than a widow struggling to survive. You saw an angel where I saw only dirt and exhaustion. I saw the truth, Orion corrected gently. The soot didn't hide you, Delilah. It just made your light shine brighter in contrast. You were always there, strong and beautiful and whole. I just helped you see it yourself. They kissed then, a kiss that held all the passion and tenderness and deep abiding love of 8 years together and a lifetime still to come. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. Come on, Delilah said, standing and pulling him to his feet. Let's go for a swim, like we should have done that first day. Are you sure? The water's pretty cold, even in summer. I'm sure. I want to remember this place, this day, this moment. I want to remember feeling this happy, this alive, this loved. So they swam in the cold mountain creek, laughing like children, splashing each other and stealing kisses in the shallows. And when they finally emerged, shivering and breathless, they dried off in the sun and made love on the soft grass of the bank, with only the mountains and the sky as witnesses. Later, as they dressed and prepared to head back to town to collect their children, Delilah turned to Orion one more time. Thank you, she said simply. For what? For seeing me, for choosing me, for loving me even when I was too stubborn to accept it, for building this life with me. She took his hand, lacing their fingers together the way she had that first day. For everything. Orion raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. Right back at you, my love. Right back at you. They walked back through the forest, hand in hand, following the familiar path towards St. Elmo. Behind them, the creek continued its eternal song. Ahead, their children waited, and all around them, the mountains stood as they always had, witnesses to a love story born in soot and ash, and transformed into something bright and enduring and beautiful. The years continued to unfold with the steady rhythm of mountain life. The charcoal business remained strong, though as the children grew older, Orion and Delilah gradually shifted more toward Orion's metalwork and less toward the grueling labor of the charcoal pits. Samuel, now a teenager, showed real talent with the forge, and Orion took pride in teaching his son the craft his own father had taught him years ago. Rebecca proved to have her mother's business sense, keeping meticulous records of sales and expenses, ensuring they always knew exactly where they stood financially. At 13, she was already talking about maybe opening a proper shop in St. Elmo instead of working from their mountain homestead. She's got ambition, Delilah said one evening as they watched Rebecca practice her sums by lamplight. More than I ever had at her age. She gets that from you, Orion replied. You had plenty of ambition. You just called it survival. Maybe, but she has options I never did, because of what we've built here. Delilah leaned into Orion's shoulder. We did good, didn't we? With this life? With these children? We did better than good. We did amazing. Michael, at 10 years old, was the wild one, always disappearing into the forest to explore or climbing trees that were far too tall, or bringing home injured animals he was convinced he could heal. Orion saw himself in the boy. that same restless energy and need to understand the natural world. "He's going to give us gray hairs," Delilah said. After the third time that summer they'd had to search for Michael when he wandered too far from home. "He's just curious. Just needs to learn the boundaries." Orion ruffled Michael's hair affectionately after the latest adventure. But yeah, probably a few gray hairs. In the spring of 1889, Tom Fletcher retired and sold his general store to a young couple from Denver. Orion and Delilah attended the farewell party in St. Elmo, bringing all three children. Tom pulled them aside near the end of the evening, his weathered face creased with emotion. "I wanted to thank you both," he said, "for showing this old town that people can change their circumstances. When Silas died, most folks figured Delilah would give up the charcoal business, maybe move away. But you didn't. You fought and survived and built something real. And Orion, you could have stayed up in your mountain isolation, but you chose differently. You both chose differently. That means something." Delilah embraced the old man, tears in her eyes. "You helped us when we needed it most. Buying the charcoal even when I could barely make enough to fill orders, extending credit when money was tight. We wouldn't have made it without you." "You'd have made it," Tom said firmly. "You're survivors, both of you. But I'm glad I could help along the way." That night, as they rode home in their wagon with the children drowsing in the back, Delilah was quiet, pensive. "What are you thinking?" Orion asked. "About how different my life could have been if you hadn't come into those woods that day. If you hadn't insisted on helping, if you hadn't seen past the soot and the stubbornness." She looked at him in the moonlight. "I'd probably be dead by now, or broken, or both." "You'd have found a way," Orion said, though he suspected she was right. "You're stronger than you know. Maybe. But I'm glad I didn't have to find out." She moved closer on the wagon's seat, nestling into his side. "I'm glad I had you instead." The summer of 1890 brought changes. Samuel, now 17, announced his intention to apprentice with a master blacksmith in Colorado Springs for a year to refine his skills. It was the right move, and both Orion and Delilah knew it. But watching their eldest son prepare to leave was harder than either had anticipated. "He'll be back," Orion assured Delilah as they helped Samuel pack his things. "A year will go fast, and then he'll come home with skills he can use to take the business even further." "I know. It's just hard to let go. He's my baby, even though he's nearly a man now." Samuel overheard and turned to his mother with a smile. "I'll always be your baby, Ma, even when I'm old and gray. And I will be back. This is home. These mountains, this family. Nothing's going to change that." True to his word, Samuel returned the following summer, his skills notably improved and his confidence soaring. He and Orion expanded the forge, building a proper workshop that could accommodate larger projects. They began taking custom orders for tools and hardware, their reputation for quality work spreading throughout the region. Rebecca, meanwhile, at 16, had caught the eye of young Daniel Morrison, the son of the new general store owners. He was a nice boy, polite and hardworking, and clearly smitten with Rebecca's sharp mind and sharper wit. "Should we be worried?" Orion asked Delilah one evening after Daniel had stopped by for the third time that week, ostensibly to check on an order, but really just to see Rebecca. "No. He's a good boy from a good family. And Rebecca's got her head on straight. She's not going to do anything foolish." Delilah paused. "Besides, we can't talk. We got married after knowing each other for only a few months." "True. Though, in our defense, we did have unusual circumstances." Every circumstance is unusual when you're in love. By the autumn of 1892, 14 years after that first meeting in the forest, life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The business was thriving, the children were growing into remarkable young adults, and Orion and Delilah had built something solid and lasting. One evening in late October, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Delilah said, "I've been thinking about that day, when you first saw me." "I think about it often," Orion admitted. "Do you ever wonder what you saw in me? Really saw beneath all that soot and exhaustion and stubbornness?" Orion was quiet for a moment, considering. "I saw someone fighting. Someone who refused to quit even when quitting would have been easier. I saw strength and courage, and a kind of fierce determination that reminded me why I fell in love with these mountains in the first place. Because they're the same way. Beautiful and harsh and unforgiving, but worth every bit of effort it takes to survive in them. That's very poetic for a mountain man. I learned from the best." He pulled her close. "But more than that, I saw someone who needed what I needed. Someone who understood loneliness and hard work and making your own way in the world. I saw a partner, even before I knew what that meant." Delilah turned to kiss him, soft and sweet. "You washed away the soot and found an angel," the storytellers say. "No," Orion corrected gently. "I washed away the soot and found you. You're better than any angel, Delilah. You're real." They sat together as darkness fell, watching the first stars emerge in the mountain sky. Inside, they could hear their children moving around, Samuel working late in the forge, Rebecca reading to Michael from one of the books she'd ordered from Denver. The sounds of family, of home, of a life fully lived. "Do you have any regrets?" Delilah asked quietly. "Not a single one. You?" "Only that I waited so long to wash my face." She laughed softly. "Think of all the time we wasted with me covered in soot." "Wasn't wasted. It was all part of the journey, and I wouldn't change a moment of it, because every moment led us here." The winter of 1892 was hard, with heavy snows that isolated the homestead for weeks at a time. But the family weathered it together, keeping the forge fires burning, working on indoor projects, telling stories, and playing games in the evenings. Samuel taught Michael the finer points of metalwork. Rebecca worked on her business plans for a potential shop in town. And Orion and Delilah simply enjoyed being together, surrounded by the family they'd created. When spring finally came, it brought news that Samuel had been offered a partnership in a blacksmith shop in St. Elmo. He accepted, and within months, Zeller and Sons became a prominent fixture on the town's main street. Rebecca, now 18, began helping manage the shop, her business acumen proving invaluable. Michael, at 14, announced his intention to become a mountain guide, leading tourists and prospectors through the peaks. "Someone needs to teach people how to survive up here," he said with all the confidence of youth. "Might as well be someone who knows these mountains like I do." "Like father, like son," Delilah murmured to Orion. "He's got your wandering spirit." "And your practical sense," Orion added. "He'll make good money at it if he's smart." The years continued their steady march. 1893 brought a financial panic that affected much of the nation. But the Zeller family weathered it relatively well thanks to their diverse income streams and careful savings. 1894 saw Rebecca's marriage to Daniel Morrison in a ceremony that had half the town in attendance. 1895 brought the birth of the first grandchild, a boy named Thomas after old Tom Fletcher, who had passed away peacefully the previous winter. Orion held his grandson for the first time with tears in his eyes. "We're grandparents," he said to Delilah in wonder. "When did we get old enough to be grandparents?" "We're not old," Delilah protested, though her hair had more silver than brown now, and lines crinkled around her eyes. "We're seasoned." "Seasoned grandparents," Orion agreed, unable to stop smiling as baby Thomas gripped his finger with surprising strength. Samuel married in 1896 to a sweet girl named Elizabeth who had moved to St. Elmo from Kansas. The wedding was held at the homestead, in the clearing where Orion had first seen Delilah struggling with that timber. It seemed fitting somehow, bringing the story full circle. Michael, true to his word, established himself as one of the most reliable mountain guides in the region. He married in 1898 to a woman named Sarah, who had come west looking for adventure and found it in both the mountains and in Michael's eyes. By the turn of the century, as the world prepared to enter the 20th century, the Zeller family had expanded to include 5 grandchildren and another on the way. The homestead that had once been a barely livable cabin was now a prosperous compound with multiple buildings, thriving gardens, and a reputation throughout Colorado. On New Year's Eve, 1899, as the family gathered to celebrate the coming new century, Orion and Delilah slipped away from the crowd. They walked through the moonlit forest to their creek, the place where so much had begun. 21 years, Delilah said, looking at the water sparkling in the starlight. "Since you brought me here and washed away the soot." "Best day of my life," Orion said. "Well, second best. The best was when you agreed to marry me." "Third best," Delilah corrected with a smile. "First was when each of our children was born, then our wedding, then this creek." "Fair enough." He pulled her into his arms, and they swayed together in the moonlight, dancing to music only they could hear. Do you ever miss it? The simplicity of those early days? Sometime. But mostly I'm just grateful we survived them, that we found each other and built something that lasted. She looked up at him, and her eyes still held that same light he'd first seen beneath the soot. "You saved my life, Orion Zeller." "No," he said firmly. "We saved each other. I was dying up here alone, even if I didn't know it yet. You gave me a reason to live, a purpose beyond just surviving. We saved each other. Delilah, that's what love does." They kissed in the moonlight, and it was just as sweet and powerful as it had been that first time, all those years ago. Some things, it seemed, only improved with time. The sound of laughter drifted through the forest from the homestead, where their family was celebrating. Their children, their grandchildren, all the lives they'd helped create and nurture. It was a legacy beyond anything either of them could have imagined on that September day in 1878, when a mountain man had stumbled across a soot-covered widow in the forest. "We should get back," Delilah said reluctantly. "They'll wonder where we've gone." "Let them wonder for a few more minutes." Orion held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, still faintly touched with wood smoke even after all these years. "I want to remember this moment. Just us, this place, this love." "I'll remember it," Delilah promised. "I remember all of them. Every kiss, every conversation, every moment we've stolen away from the world. They're all precious to me. To me too, my love. To me too." They stood there for a while longer. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from ash and determination. Two people who had looked past soot and loneliness to see the truth underneath. Two people who had chosen each other, day after day, year after year, through hardship and joy, through struggle and triumph. Finally, hand in hand, They walked back through the forest toward the lights and laughter of their home. Behind them, the creek continued its eternal song. Above them, the stars wheeled through the mountain sky. And ahead, the future waited, full of promise and possibility and love. As they emerged from the forest into the clearing, their family rushed to greet them. Samuel and Elizabeth with their 2 children, Rebecca and Daniel with little Thomas and his sister Mary, Michael and Sarah with baby John. 3 generations gathered together, all stemming from a chance meeting in the woods and a mountain man's decision to help a struggling widow. "Where were you?" Rebecca asked, though her knowing smile suggested she already knew. "Just taking a walk down memory lane," Delilah said, squeezing Orion's hand. "Well, come on, it's almost midnight. We want to ring in the new century together, all of us." They gathered on the porch as the final minutes of 1899 ticked away. Orion stood with Delilah in his arms, surrounded by their family, and felt a peace so profound it almost hurt. This was what he'd been searching for all those years ago when he'd fled Wyoming and come to these mountains. Not solitude, though, he'd thought that's what he wanted. But this, connection, purpose, love. As the clock struck midnight and everyone cheered and embraced, Orion leaned down to whisper in Delilah's ear, "Happy New Year, my love. Here's to the next century." "Happy New Year," she whispered back, "and to the next 50 years with you." "Only 50? I was hoping for at least 100. She laughed, and the sound was as beautiful as it had been the first time he'd heard it all those years ago. Always the optimist. Always the realist. Because loving you, being loved by you, that's the realest thing I've ever known. They kissed as the new century dawned, and around them, their family celebrated. The mountains stood eternal witness, as they had for millennia, as they would for millennia to come. But in that moment, on that porch, in that clearing where a charcoal maker's widow had once struggled alone, and a mountain man had found his purpose, there was only love. The years that followed brought their share of challenges. In 1902, Orion developed a persistent cough that worried Delilah until the doctor in St. Elmo assured them it was just the result of years breathing in forge smoke and mountain air. Nothing that rest and care couldn't manage. In 1904, a fire damaged part of the workshop, though thankfully no one was hurt and Samuel rebuilt it stronger than before. But there were far more joys than sorrows. More grandchildren arrived, growing the family tree. The business continued to thrive, expanding beyond what Orion and Delilah had ever dreamed possible. And through it all, their love remained the foundation upon which everything else was built. In the summer of 1906, they celebrated their 28th wedding anniversary with a party at the homestead. The whole town seemed to turn out, bringing food and gifts and stories about how the Zeller family had touched their lives. Old-timers remembered Delilah from her charcoal-making days, recalled how she'd refused to give up even when everyone expected her to fail. Younger folks knew Orion as the quiet mountain man who'd built a legacy of quality work and honest dealing. But everyone agreed that together, they were something special. A love story for the ages, people said. The mountain man who'd washed away the soot and found his angel. As the party wound down and the last guests departed, Orion and Delilah found themselves alone on the porch once more, watching the sun set over the peaks they'd called home for nearly 3 decades. 28 years, Delilah mused. Longer than I ever imagined when you first walked into that forest and insisted on helping me. I knew, Orion said. Maybe not consciously, but somewhere deep down, I knew you were it for me. The one I'd been waiting for without realizing I was waiting. You saw past the soot. I saw you. the real you. And I fell in love with every bit of it. Delilah leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge. After a while, she said, "I'm tired, Orion. Not in a bad way, just in the way of someone who's lived a full life and earned their rest. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense. I feel the same way sometimes. Like we've done what we set out to do, raised our family, built our life. Now we get to enjoy the fruits of all that labor." "I want more years with you," Delilah said fiercely. "I want to see more grandchildren grow up. I want to celebrate our 50th anniversary. I want to grow old and gray together." "We're already old and gray," Orion teased gently. "But I know what you mean. And we'll have those years, my love. I'm not going anywhere without you." And he was right. The years continued, bringing new joys and occasional sorrows, as life always does. They watched their grandchildren grow, welcomed great-grandchildren, saw the world change around them in ways both wonderful and troubling. But through it all, they had each other. In 1913, for their 35th anniversary, their children and grandchildren organized a surprise party at the creek. They decorated the banks with lanterns and flowers, set up tables with food and drink, and gathered the whole extended family in the place where it had all begun. When Orion and Delilah arrived, led there by Michael under the pretense of checking on something, they stopped in amazement at the sight. The creek sparkled with reflected lantern light, and dozens of faces smiled at them with love. "Surprise!" everyone shouted, and Delilah burst into tears of joy. "You shouldn't have," she said, embracing each of her children in turn. "This is too much." "It's not nearly enough," Rebecca said. "Not for everything you and Pa have given us. You showed us what real love looks like, what partnership looks like, what family looks like." Samuel stepped forward with a wrapped package. "We all pitched in to get you this. Open it." Inside was a painting, beautifully executed by a Denver artist they'd commissioned. It showed the creek just as it looked that very evening, with a younger Orion and Delilah standing at the water's edge. But what made it special was the detail. You could see the soot still on Delilah's face, and Orion's hand reaching out with a cloth. The moment of transformation captured forever. Delilah covered her mouth with her hands, overcome. Orion felt his own eyes sting with tears. "It's beautiful," he managed. "Thank you, all of you." They spent the evening at the creek, sharing stories and laughter, watching their grandchildren play in the water just as their own children had done years before. And as the night grew late and people began to drift home, Orion and Delilah remained behind, sitting on their favorite boulder and watching the water flow. 35 years, Delilah said. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like no time at all." "Both," Orion said. "It's both." "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't come into those woods that day? If you'd gone a different direction, or if I'd been somewhere else?" "Sometimes. But I don't think fate would have let us miss each other. One way or another, we were meant to find each other." "You really believe that? In fate?" "I believe in us. And I believe that some connections are so powerful, so fundamental, that the universe conspires to make them happen." He kissed the top of her head. "I believe we were always going to find each other, Delilah. The soot and the struggle, that was just the setting. The story was always going to be us." She turned to look at him, and in the lantern light, he could still see the young woman she'd been, the one who'd been so afraid He'd be disappointed when he saw her clean face. I love you, Orion Zeller, more now than ever. And I love you, Delilah Dalton Zeller, my stubborn, beautiful, incredible wife. Yesterday, today, and all the tomorrows we have left. They kissed in the lantern light, beside the creek that had witnessed so much of their story. And though they were both old now, gray-haired and weathered by time and life, in that moment they were young again. Two people choosing each other, day after day, year after year. The world continued its march forward. The 1910s brought automobiles and telephones and the horrors of a world war far away. But in the mountains of Colorado, at a homestead carved from wilderness and love, life went on in its own rhythm. Orion and Delilah grew older, but never old. They still worked when they could, though the heavy labor was left to younger hands now. They spent their days together, tending the garden, visiting with grandchildren, and taking slow walks through the forest they'd called home for so many years. In 1920, they celebrated their 42nd anniversary quietly. Just the two of them. Their children wanted to throw another party, but they declined, preferring to spend the day in their own way. They woke early and walked to the creek, taking their time, supporting each other over roots and stones that had become more challenging with age. At the water's edge, they sat on their boulder and watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. 42 years, Delilah said. Who would have thought? I would have, Orion replied. From the moment you said yes, I knew we'd go the distance. I'm so glad you were right. She took his hand, her fingers still strong despite their age. I'm so glad you saw past the soot all those years ago, that you gave me a chance to be more than a struggling widow. You were always more than that. I just helped you see it. They sat in silence for a while, comfortable and content. Then Delilah said, I'm ready, you know. Ready for what? For whatever comes next. I've lived a full life, a good life. I've loved and been loved. I've raised children and seen them raise children of their own. I've built something that will last beyond me. If tomorrow is my last day, I'll die content. Orion's throat tightened. He wanted to protest, to say they had years left, decades maybe. But he knew what she meant. They were both in their 70s now, had beaten the odds just by surviving this long in such a harsh environment. I'm not ready, he admitted. I'll never be ready to lose you. You won't lose me. I'll always be with you, in every tree in this forest, in every ripple of this creek, in the faces of our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I'll be in the forge where you taught Samuel to work metal, in the cabin we built together, in every corner of the life we created. I know, but I'll still miss you, every minute of every day. Then don't miss me. Remember me. Remember us. And keep living, Orion. Promise me that. Don't crawl into a cave and give up if I go first. Keep living, keep loving, keep being the man I fell in love with. He pulled her close, holding her as tightly as he dared, feeling the fragility of her bones beneath the strength that still resided in her spirit. I promise, but only if you promise the same. If I go first, you keep going. You hear me? You keep going. I promise, she whispered. They stayed at the creek until noon, then made their slow way back to the homestead. Their children had disobeyed their wishes and organized a small family dinner after all, but neither of them minded. It was good to be surrounded by the fruits of their love, by the generations they'd brought into being. That night, lying in bed in the cabin they'd shared for more than 4 decades, Delilah turned to Orion in the darkness. Tell me again, she said, about the day you first saw me. It was a story they'd told many times over the years, but it never got old. "I was tracking a deer," Orion began, his voice soft in the darkness. "And I heard this sound, like someone struggling. So I went to investigate. And there you were, covered in soot from head to toe, trying to drag a branch twice your size up a hill. You looked like you'd crawled out of a coal mine. But even then, I could see something in the way you moved, something determined and fierce and absolutely captivating. And then you insisted on helping me, even though I told you to go away." "You did tell me to go away," Orion agreed with a chuckle. "Multiple times, if I recall. But I'm stubborn too. Runs in the family, apparently. And then you told me to go wash my face in the creek. Because you needed to. You were exhausted and filthy and working yourself to death. Someone had to intervene. And when I came out of the water, you saw an angel." "No," Orion corrected, as he always did. "I saw you, and you were better than any angel. You were real and beautiful and everything I'd been searching for without knowing I was searching." Delilah snuggled closer, fitting into his side the way she had thousands of times before. "Best day of my life." "Mine too, my love. Mine too." They drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, the way they had for 42 years. And if either of them worried about the future, about the inevitable separation that time would bring, they didn't speak of it. In that moment, they had everything they needed: each other, their family, their memories, and the deep, abiding love that had sustained them through every trial. The years that followed were kind. Both Orion and Delilah lived into their 80s, defying the expectations of everyone who knew them. They celebrated their 50th anniversary in 1928 with a massive party that brought together 5 generations of family. The photograph taken that day showed them surrounded by children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and even 2 great-great-grandchildren, all bearing witness to the legacy of love they'd created. On quiet evenings, they still walked to the creek when they could, holding hands and remembering. And when their bodies finally grew too frail for the journey, they'd sit on their porch and watch the forest, seeing it all in their mind's eye. Delilah passed away peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1930, with Orion beside her and their children surrounding the bed. Her last words were, "I see you. Past all the soot, I see you." And though everyone else was confused, Orion understood. She was taking him with her, even as she left. He kept his promise. He didn't crawl into a cave and give up. He lived for 3 more years, spending his time with his family, telling stories about Delilah to anyone who would listen, making sure her memory stayed bright and beautiful. When Orion finally followed his wife into whatever lay beyond in the winter of 1933, he died with a smile on his face and her name on his lips. His children found him in his chair on the porch, facing the direction of the creek, looking peaceful and content. They buried him beside Delilah in the cemetery in St. Elmo, under a shared headstone that read simply, Orion Zeller, 1851-1933, and Delilah Dalton Zeller, 1854-1930. They saw past the soot and found each other. But their true legacy wasn't in stone. It was in the dozens of descendants who carried their blood and their values forward into the future. It was in the stories passed down through generations about the mountain man and the charcoal maker's widow who'd built a love story for the ages. It was in the creek that still flowed clear and cold, witness to countless kisses and quiet conversations. It was in the mountains themselves, eternal and unchanging, holding the memory of 2 people who'd refused to give up on life or love. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the pines and the water burbled over the stones. Some folks swore they could still see them there. A tall man with broad shoulders and long hair, and a woman with dark waves and gray-green eyes, standing at the water's edge with their hands intertwined, looking at each other like they were the only two people in the world. Because in all the ways that mattered, they were. They'd found each other against all odds, built something beautiful from ash and determination, and created a legacy that would outlast them both. And that, in the end, was all that anyone could ask for. To love and be loved. To build and create. To leave the world a little better than you found it. To see past the soot and find the angel. Or better yet, the real person hiding underneath. Perfect in their imperfection. That was the story of Orion Zeller and Delilah Dalton. The mountain man and the charcoal maker's widow. Two lonely souls who'd found each other in the wilderness of Colorado and created something eternal. A love story written in soot and water, in struggle and perseverance, in the quiet daily choice to keep choosing each other, day after day, year after year, until death and beyond. And in the mountains of Colorado, where the aspens still turned gold each autumn and the creeks still ran cold with snowmelt each spring, their story lived on. Told and retold, embellished and remembered. A reminder that love could bloom anywhere, even in the darkest of circumstances, if two people were brave enough to see past the surface and recognize the truth underneath. The end of their story was really just the beginning. Because every descendant who looked in the mirror and saw Orion's strong jaw or Delilah's gray-green eyes was a continuation of what they'd started. Every couple who visited the creek and made wishes for their own lasting love was honoring their memory. Every person who chose to see past the surface of another human being and recognize the beauty within was living their legacy. Orion had washed away the soot and seen an angel. But more than that, he'd seen Delilah, and she'd seen him right back. Two people recognizing each other, soul deep, and deciding that was enough. More than enough, everything. That was their story. That was their gift to the world. And long after the last person who'd known them personally had passed away, long after their cabin had crumbled and their forge had gone cold, long after the last physical trace of their existence had faded from the earth, their story remained. Because love stories like theirs never really end. They just transform, becoming part of the fabric of the world itself, woven into the mountains and the trees and the water and the sky, eternal as the land that witnessed them, beautiful as the love that created them, real as the two people who'd lived them, day by precious day, until their last breath and beyond. Orion and Delilah, the mountain man and the widow, the washer and the washed, the seer and the seen. Two halves of one whole, forever intertwined, forever remembered, forever loved. And somewhere in those Colorado mountains, if you're quiet enough and patient enough and open enough to believe, you can still hear them. The sound of laughter echoing through the pines, the splash of water in the creek, the rustle of two people walking hand in hand through the forest they called home. Still together, still choosing each other, still living the love story that death itself couldn't end. Because some loves are bigger than life. Some loves write themselves into the very bones of the earth. Some loves refuse to be forgotten, refuse to fade, refuse to become just another story that people half remember and mostly forget. The love of Orion Zeller and Delilah Dalton was one of those. A love born in soot and ash, washed clean in mountain water, forged strong in the fires of daily life, and made eternal by the simple choice to see each other truly and love what they saw. That was their story. That was their triumph. That was their gift to all who came after, a reminder that love was always worth fighting for, always worth choosing, always worth the risk and the struggle, and the daily work of showing up and being present and seeing past the surface to the truth underneath. And in that truth, they'd found everything they needed, everything they'd ever wanted, everything that mattered, each other.